He walked onto the plane like any other passenger, calm, quiet, and holding a first-class ticket. But just minutes after sitting down, a flight attendant stood over him and said 5 sharp words, "You don't belong up here." She didn't check twice. She didn't ask questions. She made him walk to the back of the plane. What she didn't know? The man she just humiliated with a smile wasn't just another traveler. He was a federal judge with the power to turn her entire world upside down. And with one phone call, he did. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next one. He stepped onto the plane quietly, dressed in a navy blue suit with polished shoes and a calm presence that turned a few heads, though he didn't seem to notice. In his right hand, he carried a worn leather briefcase, and in his left, a neatly folded boarding pass. His name was Jerome Collins, a senior federal judge known in the legal world for his sharp mind and silent strength. As he reached seat 1A in the first-class cabin, he nodded politely at a flight attendant by the door and sat down with quiet ease. Jerome placed his briefcase under the seat, adjusted his seatbelt, and pulled out a slim book of poetry from his coat pocket. He didn't glance at his phone. He didn't greet anyone around him. He simply sat, composed, turning the pages with a slow rhythm, like a man used to patience and silence. Not far down the aisle, Rachel Benton, the lead flight attendant on the flight, was moving through the cabin with her usual routine sharpness. She was tall, her posture perfect, her expression professional with a touch of pride. Her uniform was without a wrinkle, and her eyes scanned the seats as if she were inspecting soldiers. As she moved into first class, her gaze swept past the usual business travelers until it stopped. Her steps slowed. Her eyes landed on Jerome, and her polite expression faltered for just a moment. She hesitated. Then she straightened her shoulders and approached his seat. "Excuse me, sir," Rachel said, loud enough that several nearby passengers turned to look. "Can I see your boarding pass again, please?" Jerome looked up, surprised but not bothered. His voice was calm. "Certainly." He handed it to her without hesitation. Rachel held the pass and stared at it, blinking slowly. "This says seat 1A, she said, emphasizing each word as if explaining something complicated. "This is a first-class seat." "Yes, it is," Jerome answered evenly. She glanced at the name again, then at his face, then back to the pass. "Are you sure this isn't a mistake? Maybe your company booked the wrong class." Jerome shook his head once. "No mistake." Rachel's voice stiffened. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move to economy. We can sort this out later, but right now, I need this seat cleared." The cabin went quiet. A few heads turned fully toward them. One woman lowered her magazine to watch. Jerome closed his book slowly, slid the boarding pass back into his coat pocket and stood up. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. He simply picked up his briefcase and walked toward the back, eyes forward, jaw tight. Rachel stepped aside, arms crossed lightly. As he passed, she exhaled through her nose, as if settling a disturbance. Jerome made his way to the last rows of the plane and found an open seat near the rear. He placed his bag under the seat and sat, still composed. He took out his phone, unlocked it, and typed a brief message. "Removed from first class. Boarding pass denied. No explanation. Waiting." He hit send. The screen went black. His face was still. He looked down at his hands for a moment, then out the small window beside him. What Rachel hadn't realized was that the man she had just humiliated wasn't just another passenger. He was someone whose single phone call could bring everything she knew crashing down, and that call had just been made. Back in first class, Rachel Benton moved through the cabin with renewed confidence, offering drinks and greeting other passengers with bright smiles. The small incident with Jerome had already faded from her mind. In her view, she had just corrected an error, nothing more. She prided herself on keeping the cabin orderly and professional. She didn't notice the glances from a few passengers who had seen what happened. Some whispered quietly. Others looked away, unsure of what they had just witnessed but uncomfortable all the same. In the rear of the plane, Jerome Collins sat quietly, his long legs slightly cramped in the narrow economy seat. He didn't complain. He didn't sigh. He sat with his hands resting on the armrests, his expression unreadable. But beneath that calm exterior, his mind was moving. He wasn't angry yet. He was disappointed, not just at the humiliation, but at how easily it happened. How casually Rachel had dismissed him without any real cause. His phone vibrated once. The message read, "Who removed you?" "What airline? Flight number?" He responded without delay, typing each word carefully. "Flight 714, Horizon Air. Flight attendant, Rachel Benton." There was no reply. He didn't need one. The person on the other end had all the information they needed. A few rows up, a young flight attendant named Clara Green walked toward the galley to grab extra water bottles. As she passed Rachel, she paused slightly. "Hey, that man you moved earlier? I saw his ticket when he boarded. It really did say 1A. Rachel didn't even look up. "I know what I saw," she said coldly. "The system must have had a glitch or he got upgraded by mistake." Clara hesitated. But he didn't argue. He seemed sure. Rachel turned to face her, her voice low but firm. "Look, Clara, I've been doing this for 15 years. I can tell when someone's out of place. Trust me, if he belonged up here, he would have said something. Let's not make this a thing, okay?" Clara nodded slowly and walked away, her expression troubled. Rachel returned to her tray service, smiling and chatting with other first-class passengers. She had no idea that just a few feet below her, in a quiet operations room on the ground, alarm bells had started ringing. And somewhere in that chain of calls, someone had just uttered the words, "Get the captain on the line, now." In the cockpit, Captain Richard Ames was going through routine flight checks when the in-flight phone beside him lit up. It was an unusual time for a ground operations call. He picked it up, expecting a standard update. Instead, the voice on the other end was clipped and direct. "Captain Ames, this is Malcolm Briggs from Horizon Air's executive response team. We've received a report involving a passenger in first class who was wrongly removed. His name is Jerome Collins." Captain Ames blinked. The name sounded familiar. "He's a federal judge," the voice continued. "Senior bench, known for working closely with the Aviation Oversight Board. He was holding a valid first-class ticket for seat 1A. Your lead attendant forced him to relocate to economy, citing false reasons." The cockpit grew still. The co-pilot looked over, confused. A chill ran through the captain's spine. "Sir," he said carefully, "we weren't informed of any issue in first class." "You are now," Malcolm replied sharply. "We need you to speak with the lead flight attendant immediately. Confirm the situation. Judge Collins has already contacted his office and legal is involved. We've briefed the CEO. I've been instructed to tell you, treat this as a crisis." Captain Ames swallowed. Understood. He ended the call, slowly replaced the receiver, and turned to the intercom. His voice was calm, but a little tighter than usual. "Lead flight attendant Rachel Benton, please report to the cockpit." In the galley, Rachel stiffened as the message came through. Flight attendants usually weren't summoned mid-air unless there was an emergency. She straightened her uniform, ran a quick hand over her hair, and made her way to the front, heels clicking quietly on the carpeted floor. When she stepped inside the cockpit, the captain turned toward her, his jaw tight. "Rachel, I just got off the phone with ground operations. Did you remove a passenger from seat 1A? Rachel blinked, confused by the question. "Yes, a man was seated there. I checked his pass, but he didn't look." She stopped herself. "Didn't look what?" She hesitated. "I assumed it was a mistake. He didn't fit the usual profile." Captain Ames's eyes narrowed slightly. "You assumed?" Rachel's throat went dry. "Rachel," he said slowly, "that passenger is Judge Jerome Collins. You just moved a sitting federal judge from first class without cause. Legal is involved. The executive team is watching this flight now in real time." Rachel's stomach twisted. I didn't know." "That's the problem," the captain replied. "You should have known. You had his boarding pass. You had access to the manifest. Her voice dropped to a whisper. What do you want me to do? He stared at her for a moment before replying. You're going to fix it. Now. Rachel stepped out of the cockpit with her heart pounding in her chest. The calm control she always carried now felt like a mask slipping off. She moved down the aisle quickly, forcing her expression back into something polite, but her palms were sweaty, and the back of her neck felt hot. As she reached the economy section, passengers turned to look at her. A few whispered. Word had started to spread. Jerome sat quietly in his seat, eyes forward, arms resting gently on the armrests. His posture hadn't changed. He looked like a man at peace, but there was something in the way he held still, like a storm just waiting behind a calm sky. Rachel crouched slightly beside him, forcing a tight smile. Sir, she began, her voice hushed but strained. There's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat in first class. Jerome turned his head slowly to face her. His gaze was level, unreadable. He didn't respond immediately. Rachel's smile flickered. I apologize for the inconvenience, she added quickly, her tone more rehearsed than sincere. He looked at her for a moment longer, then spoke. A misunderstanding? Rachel nodded too quickly. Yes, an error. It wasn't intentional. Jerome raised an eyebrow. You had my boarding pass, you looked at my name. You saw my seat number. What exactly did you misunderstand? The people nearby were listening now, some turning their heads openly, others pretending not to. But all of them were watching. Rachel felt the heat rise to her cheeks. She began, but her voice caught. Jerome continued, his voice calm and even. You didn't question anyone else in first class. Just me. Why is that? Rachel opened her mouth, then closed it. The silence was louder than anything she could have said. Jerome stood slowly, picked up his briefcase, and stepped into the aisle. Let's go, he said softly, but the weight in his tone made Rachel feel smaller with each word. The walk back to first class felt like a march through judgment. Passengers looked at her, their eyes no longer admiring or neutral, but sharp, questioning. Some leaned out of their rows to catch a better look. Jerome didn't say a word as he returned to seat 1A. He placed his bag under the seat again, sat down, and buckled in like nothing had happened. Rachel hovered beside him for a moment, unsure if she should say more. If there's anything you need, she mumbled, please let me know. Jerome didn't even turn his head. He opened his book, flipped to the page he had marked earlier, and continued reading. Rachel turned and walked away, each step slower than the last. She felt every stare on her back. She had returned him to his seat, but it was clear to everyone on board, this was far from over. Rachel returned to the galley like a shadow of the person she had been just an hour ago. Her shoulders, once straight and sure, now slumped slightly, her footsteps heavier. She busied herself with cups and trays, pretending to organize supplies that were already in perfect order. But nothing could distract her from the growing pressure in her chest. She had felt powerful earlier, in control of her environment. Now, the silence from the crew and the stares from the passengers made the cabin feel colder, smaller. Clara stood nearby, her hands folded behind her back. She didn't speak at first. She had seen everything, the public removal, the walk of return, and Rachel's attempt at an apology. The mood had shifted. Even the sound of the engines seemed more distant now. Finally, Clara broke the silence. You okay? Rachel didn't look up. I'm fine. You don't look fine. I said I'm fine, Rachel snapped, then instantly regretted the sharpness in her voice. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadied her breath, then lowered her voice. I just need to get through this flight. Clara watched her for a few seconds, then leaned forward slightly. You know who he is, right? Rachel looked up, her eyes tired. I know now. He didn't say a word, didn't raise his voice, didn't insult you. Clara's voice was quiet, but steady. That silence, that's what scared me. Rachel didn't answer. She poured herself a cup of water and took a slow sip, her hands still trembling. She had dealt with angry passengers, aggressive ones, even abusive ones. But Jerome hadn't shown anger. He had shown restraint, dignity, and somehow, that made her feel even smaller. At the front of the plane, Jerome sat quietly in seat 1A, his book resting on his lap now, untouched. He wasn't reading anymore. He was thinking about what had happened and about how quickly a moment of prejudice could unravel someone's entire sense of justice. He had worked his entire life to build his name, but all it took was one glance from a flight attendant who decided he didn't look like he belonged. His phone buzzed again. A short message on the screen. Internal review initiated. CEO looped in. Action pending upon landing. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply read the message and locked the screen again. His hands folded together in his lap. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't about payback. It was about principle. Passengers near him shifted in their seats. Some avoided his gaze. A few glanced at him with a kind of quiet recognition. They knew now. He was no ordinary passenger, and they had all witnessed what had happened, and done nothing. Rachel remained in the galley, staring blankly at the metal wall in front of her. She didn't know that Jerome's call had already reached the top. She didn't know that Horizon Air's legal and PR teams were already preparing statements. She didn't know that, somewhere in a corporate office downtown, her employee file had just been pulled. All she knew was that her authority, her sense of control, was gone. And the most terrifying part? It wasn't just one mistake. It was the reason behind it. Time passed slowly in the cabin. The usual buzz of in-flight service had turned into something quieter, tenser. Conversations were shorter, movements more cautious. Even the passengers who hadn't witnessed the incident could feel that something wasn't right. It was the kind of atmosphere where people exchanged glances but said nothing out loud. Everyone knew something had happened, but no one wanted to be the first to speak. In first class, Jerome sat like a statue. His posture was calm, but his presence had grown heavier. The same passengers who had once ignored him now watched him from the corners of their eyes. Some wore guilt, others wore curiosity, but none of them looked him in the eye for long. A middle-aged man across the aisle, wearing a gray blazer and noise-canceling headphones, slowly took the headphones off and leaned toward Jerome, clearing his throat. I saw what happened earlier," he said quietly. "That was unfortunate." Jerome turned slightly to face him. "Unfortunate?" he asked, not unkindly, but not letting the word pass unnoticed. The man shifted. "Yes, I mean, clearly a mistake." Jerome raised an eyebrow. "A mistake?" he repeated. The man hesitated. Or perhaps a misunderstanding. Jerome didn't respond. The silence stretched again, thick with meaning. After a moment, he looked away and returned to his seat position. The conversation was over. At the front of the cabin, Rachel stood just behind the curtain, listening to everything. She had stepped out of the galley to check the aisles, but really she was trying to read the mood, trying to gauge how bad the damage might be. And the more she listened, the more unsettled she became. She pulled out her phone discreetly and opened the internal crew chat app. Nothing had been said yet. No messages, no warnings, no news. But the silence didn't calm her. It terrified her. She thought back to Jerome's face when she told him to move. Not angry, not loud, just still, unshaken. It wasn't the kind of calm that came from giving up. It was the kind that came from knowing exactly who you are and exactly what you can do without saying a single word. In the galley, Clara stood again, arms crossed, leaning gently against a cabinet. "You think they're going to talk to you when we land?" she asked. Rachel looked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean management, HR, whoever handles these kinds of things." Rachel sighed, rubbing her temple. "I told the captain I made a mistake." Clara tilted her head. "Is that really what it was?" Rachel didn't answer. She knew what she had done. She knew why she had done it. And the worst part was she couldn't even tell herself it was accidental. She hadn't asked to see anyone else's boarding pass in first class, just his, and not because of what he did, but because of how he looked. Meanwhile, back in seat 1A, Jerome's phone buzzed once again. This time, the message was short. CEO is briefed. Direct action will be taken upon landing. Be prepared for formal apology and crew review. He exhaled through his nose. Calm as ever, he didn't want a show, he didn't need drama. He needed accountability. He glanced toward the curtain where Rachel had disappeared moments earlier. The curtain didn't move, but he could sense it. Her discomfort, her fear, her awareness that something had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. Behind her composed appearance, Rachel felt it too. She had crossed a line, and the consequences were already waiting for her at the gate. The hum of the engines remained steady, but the energy inside the cabin had shifted completely. It wasn't just the silence from the crew or the whispered exchanges between passengers. It was something deeper, a weight in the air, a quiet tension that made people sit a little straighter, speak a little softer, and watch more closely. Captain Richard Ames sat in the cockpit reviewing flight data, but his attention kept drifting. He had flown for over 20 years. He'd seen unruly passengers, disruptive behavior, emergencies, and even a few scandalous incidents that made the news. But this was different. It wasn't just about a passenger being moved. It was about who that passenger was, and how easily someone with power had been treated as if they had none. The in-flight phone rang again. He picked it up immediately. "Captain Ames," came the voice from the operations center. "The CEO has authorized a formal crew review on landing. A private vehicle will meet Judge Collins at the gate. Security will escort the lead flight attendant for questioning. You're to be fully transparent. No internal delay. We're moving quickly on this." Captain Ames gave a slow nod. "Understood. I'll make sure the crew is prepared." As he hung up, he rubbed the side of his jaw. He had a sinking feeling that this would be the kind of flight people remembered long after it landed. Meanwhile, Rachel stood in the galley, staring blankly at the drawer of snack trays. She hadn't touched anything in over 10 minutes. She heard Clara moving behind her, felt her presence like a shadow that wouldn't go away. "They just called the cockpit again," Clara said, breaking the silence. "Did he tell you?" Rachel didn't turn around. "No." "Well, something's happening. You can feel it." Rachel slowly turned to face her. "I know," she said quietly. Clara hesitated, then added, "You should probably start thinking about what you're going to say when we land. This isn't going to disappear." Rachel clenched her jaw. "It was one mistake." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Was it, though?" Rachel didn't answer. She couldn't. Deep down, she knew it wasn't a single mistake. It was years of silent habits, unchecked assumptions, things she had told herself were harmless. She had always trusted her instincts, but today, those instincts had led her straight into disaster. And now, she was trapped in the aftermath. In seat 1A, Jerome glanced at his phone again. Another message had arrived, this one from a familiar name. Someone from the Board of Judicial Conduct. It was a short note of support, acknowledging the incident, and informing him that a formal communication had already been sent to the airline's board of directors. He hadn't asked them to do that, but that was the thing about quiet respect. It moved on its own. Across the aisle, more passengers were beginning to realize something was wrong. A woman leaned toward the man beside her and whispered, "I think that's the guy from earlier. The one they moved to the back. He's back in first class now?" "Yes. And something's going on. The flight attendants are acting strange." Whispers like that didn't stay whispers for long. Word began to ripple through the cabin. Back in the galley, Rachel gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles pale. She had spent years building her reputation. She was known for being sharp, efficient, no nonsense. She didn't tolerate disorder. She ran a tight ship. But this time, her tight ship had ignored the truth, and now it was heading straight into the rocks. She turned suddenly. "I need a moment," she said flatly to Clara. Without waiting for a reply, she pushed past the curtain and made her way toward the restroom, her steps fast and stiff. As she passed through the aisle, a few passengers looked up. She kept her eyes low, For the first time in her career, she didn't want to be seen. She locked the restroom door behind her and leaned over the sink, staring at her own reflection. The fluorescent lighting made her look older. Her eyes were red at the edges. Her lips were pressed tight. She splashed cold water on her face and gripped the counter to steady herself. Her heart was racing, not from guilt, not even from fear of losing her job. It was from something worse, the realization that the damage was done, and it was public. There was no fixing this mid-air, no smoothing it over with a report or a soft apology. Someone had watched her decide, without cause, that a man didn't belong where he had paid to sit. And now that man had every resource, every voice, every platform at his fingertips. And he had chosen not to shout, not to rage, not to threaten. He had chosen to wait. And that silence was about to become louder than anything Rachel had ever faced. The seatbelt sign flicked on with a soft ding, signaling the beginning of descent. The voice of Captain Ames came over the intercom with the usual landing announcement, calm and practiced, but to many in the cabin, it barely registered. Eyes shifted. Conversations stopped. The mood had thickened into something almost physical. Rachel stepped out of the restroom with her hair slightly undone and her eyes dull with exhaustion. She avoided the mirror this time. She had already seen enough. As she walked back toward the galley, her gaze swept over the cabin. She felt the looks, subtle but there. Some passengers glanced up and immediately looked away. Others held their stares for a second longer, not with hatred, but with awareness. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer in charge. Clara stood by the galley entrance. She didn't smile. She didn't move. She just watched. Rachel said nothing as she passed her, brushing past the curtain and grabbing a stack of landing cards. Her hands shook slightly. She wasn't sure if she should continue the routine. Part of her wanted to pretend everything was normal, but it wasn't. She knew that. Everyone knew that. In seat 1A, Jerome buckled his seatbelt with smooth, deliberate motions. He folded the poem book he'd kept in his lap and slipped it into the side pocket of his briefcase. He sat back, his posture calm as ever. His phone vibrated one last time. The message was short. Security is at the gate. You'll be escorted first. Media inquiry already sent to the airline. He placed the phone face down on the tray table. He didn't want to see any more updates. Not yet. Not until the wheels touched ground. The cabin tilted slightly as the aircraft began its approach. The lights dimmed, casting long shadows across the faces of the passengers. Some were staring straight ahead, pretending not to be curious. Others stole glances toward Jerome. He hadn't said a word since returning to first class, but that silence had said enough. Across the aisle, the man in the gray blazer leaned slightly to his left, as if trying to catch Jerome's attention again. But he stopped himself. There was nothing more to say. He had already said too little when it mattered. Rachel stood frozen by the service area, staring blankly at the safety placards. Her mind was spinning. She didn't know exactly what would happen when they landed. She had never been in a situation like this. She had always been the one writing incident reports, never the subject of them. "Rachel," Clara said softly from behind her. "You should sit down. We're about to land." Rachel turned, surprised by the gentleness in Clara's voice. But it didn't make her feel better. It only made her feel more exposed. "I'll wait," Rachel murmured. "Just a few more minutes." In the cockpit, Captain Ames focused on the controls, his voice calm as he spoke to air traffic control. But his thoughts were elsewhere. He had seen the report sent from the operations team. He had read the subject line. High alert, public relations risk, executive oversight required. He knew what that meant. A statement would be issued within hours. Journalists might already be on the scent. And the name Jerome Collins would be trending by morning. The runway appeared in the distance, blurred by thin clouds. The descent was smooth, steady. As the wheels touched down with a low rumble, a quiet ripple passed through the cabin. But it wasn't the usual collective relief of arrival. It was something heavier. Jerome adjusted his jacket and glanced out the window. His expression didn't change. But the weight of what had happened, of what was still coming, settled deeper in his chest. He had sat silently and watched as the people around him had pretended not to see. He had been moved without cause, dismissed without thought, and only after a single message did anyone even care to ask what had happened. And now, the door at the front of the plane was about to open. Rachel stood still as the brakes hissed and the aircraft slowed to a gentle halt. Her throat was dry, her hands cold, and for the first time in her entire career, she wasn't sure what to do next. Because now, the flight was over, and her reckoning had just begun. The aircraft rolled to a slow stop at the gate, the sound of hydraulics hissing as the engines wound down. A final soft ding rang out overhead, signaling the end of the flight. But no one unbuckled. No one stood. It was as if every passenger instinctively knew that this wasn't just another routine landing. Rachel stood in the galley, unmoving. Her eyes were fixed on the front door of the plane, which still hadn't opened. She couldn't hear the chatter of passengers anymore. Couldn't hear Clara shifting trays or folding blankets. All she could hear was the sound of her own pulse thumping hard in her ears. Her breath caught as the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Ames said, his voice calm but firmer than usual, "please remain seated. We'll begin deplaning shortly. Thank you for flying with us." The moment of silence that followed was heavy. Rachel glanced toward the cockpit, expecting some signal, but none came. Then, the door opened with a click and a slow, pressurized hiss. Bright white light from the jet bridge spilled into the entryway. The first figure to step on board was a man in a black suit. No airline logo, no name tag, just sharp eyes and a serious face. He was followed by a second man wearing a security badge clipped to his belt and an earpiece curled around his neck. Behind them, a third person waited, holding a tablet and wearing a lanyard with a large silver badge that read, "Internal Affairs, Horizon Air." Rachel's stomach turned. The suited man nodded at the captain, then turned to Clara. "We're here for two things," he said quietly but clearly. "We'll escort Mr. Collins first, then we'll speak to your lead." Clara's face froze. She gave a slow nod and stepped back. The security officer walked calmly down the aisle toward seat 1A. The passengers watched openly now, no longer trying to pretend they weren't involved. Some leaned into the aisle, others whispered under their breath. Every eye followed him. Jerome Collins remained seated. He had already collected his things, briefcase closed, jacket buttoned. He didn't need to be told. He saw the officer approach and simply stood. The security officer nodded respectfully. "Sir, we're ready when you are." Jerome glanced once around the cabin at the passengers who had looked away earlier, the ones who had whispered, the ones who had done nothing. Then he gave a slow nod and walked down the aisle, briefcase in hand, back straight, expression calm. No one spoke as he passed. A few bowed their heads slightly. One woman whispered, "He handled that with class." As he reached the door, Rachel instinctively took a step forward, her lips parting as if to say something. But Jerome didn't even glance at her. He stepped off the plane without a word, his silence as powerful as any speech. The suited man turned to Clara again. "And now we'd like to speak with Ms. Rachel Benton." Rachel felt her entire body tense. Her feet didn't want to move. Clara didn't say anything. She simply looked at Rachel and then stepped aside. The Internal Affairs officer raised his tablet. "Ms. Benton, please bring your identification and crew pass. You'll be escorted to the operations room. We'll be conducting a preliminary review before full debriefing." Rachel nodded stiffly, every step feeling like it was made of stone as she moved toward them. As she passed through the curtain into the main cabin, the air felt different. The power she once carried, the presence that had commanded attention, was gone. Passengers watched her now, not with curiosity, but with quiet judgment. When she passed seat 1A, now empty, she paused briefly, her eyes drawn to the headrest. It still held the imprint of the man she had tried to push away. She looked away and kept walking. At the gate, Jerome was met by two senior executives from Horizon Air. One extended a hand. Mr. Collins, I want to express our deepest apologies on behalf of the entire company. Jerome looked at the man's hand for a moment before shaking it. His grip was firm, steady. There will be a full investigation. The executive continued. Immediate steps are being taken. This will not be ignored. Jerome didn't reply right away. Then, finally, he said, This isn't about me. The executive nodded quickly. We understand. Jerome turned slightly toward the window. Outside, the plane still sat at the gate, its nose pointed toward the terminal, unaware of the storm now brewing around it. Back on the aircraft, as Rachel stepped off into the terminal under escort, flashbulbs from waiting media flickered, followed by a flurry of voices. Is it true you removed a federal judge from his seat? Do you have anything to say about the discrimination claims? Were you aware of who he was? She flinched at the questions but said nothing, walking faster toward the corridor. Her name would be on every article by morning. She already knew it. And what she feared most wasn't just losing her job. It was that the whole world would now see what she had tried to hide behind policy, behind authority, behind the uniform. That, in one quick judgment, she had shown exactly who she was. The terminal buzzed with the usual airport noise, wheels rolling across polished floors, flight announcements echoing from overhead speakers, children tugging at parents, and travelers rushing to gates. But just outside Gate 6B, something far from ordinary was unfolding. A group of onlookers had gathered near the windows, murmuring quietly, their attention fixed on the jet bridge. Phones were raised. Security personnel stood at intervals, positioned with silent authority. The usual flow of passengers had slowed to a curious trickle. Jerome Collins stood just past the arrival gate, surrounded by a small circle of airline executives and legal staff. Though several tried to speak, he responded with little more than nods or brief acknowledgments. He wasn't interested in apologies delivered under pressure. He had seen enough of them, heard enough of them. What mattered now wasn't who said sorry. It was what the airline would do next when no one was watching. One of the executives, a tall woman with a crisp blazer and a trembling clipboard in hand, spoke up. Judge Collins, we've already begun formal internal action. Ms. Benton is being questioned by Internal Affairs. We will notify your office as soon as the review is complete. Jerome gave a slight nod, his eyes drifting to the side. Through the glass, he could see the aircraft still docked, passengers beginning to disembark, moving quietly past the door. Their eyes searched the terminal for taxis and luggage signs, but occasionally they would glance toward him. Some offered a faint nod of respect, others looked away. Behind him, a press officer leaned in and whispered, Sir, we'd like to release a public statement. With your permission, we can include a quote from you. Jerome didn't look at him. Not yet. The officer hesitated, then stepped back. Meanwhile, inside a quiet conference room in the back corridors of the airport, Rachel Benton sat alone at a long table. Her hands clasped tightly together, her crew badge placed neatly in front of her like a confession. The room was sterile. White walls, cold lighting, no windows. A screen on the wall displayed the airline's logo, soft and corporate. The ticking of the wall clock seemed to echo louder than it should have. She had been sitting for 17 minutes without anyone speaking to her. Her palms were sweating, and she had wiped them twice on her skirt. Across from her sat two airline investigators, one from Human Resources, the other from Legal Compliance. The man from Legal, a stern figure named Glenn Pierce, finally lifted a tablet and pressed a button. A recording light flickered on. Ms. Benton, this is a formal inquiry into the events that took place aboard Flight 714 regarding your removal of a first-class passenger, Mr. Jerome Collins. Do you acknowledge this incident occurred? Rachel swallowed, her voice scratchy. Yes. Did you verify Mr. Collins's boarding pass before asking him to leave his seat? I did. I looked at it. And? She hesitated. I didn't think it was real. It didn't match my expectations. Glenn didn't blink. What expectations? Rachel faltered. Her throat tightened. He just didn't seem like a first-class passenger. You mean by how he looked? Silence. Glenn leaned forward. Let's be very clear, Ms. Benton. You removed a federal judge from his assigned first-class seat despite having a valid ticket in your hand. You did so without following protocol. No check with the gate agent, no manifest verification, no crew escalation. And you did so in a manner that was public, humiliating, and witnessed by over 30 passengers in your cabin. I didn't know who he was, she said quickly. That's not the issue, Glenn replied coldly. The issue is that you assumed who he wasn't. Rachel's eyes filled with moisture, but she blinked rapidly, refusing to cry in front of them. She wanted to argue. She wanted to say it had all happened too fast, that she'd made a snap call, that she thought she was doing her job, but the words dried up in her mouth. She had nothing to defend herself with. The HR officer, a woman with quiet eyes and a notebook filled with scribbles, looked up. Ms. Benton, this isn't just a policy violation. This is a matter of public trust and now of public reputation. The judge hasn't filed a lawsuit yet, but a formal discrimination complaint has already reached our board. This incident is being reviewed for termination. Rachel closed her eyes. 10 years. 10 years of perfect flights, punctual reports, leadership reviews, and crew management. All of it reduced to a few silent lines on an investigation form. All of it undone by one choice she couldn't take back. Will I be allowed to speak to him? She asked suddenly. Glenn shook his head. That's not up to us. In the terminal lounge, Jerome sat in a quieter waiting area with a glass of water and his phone beside him. He had declined media interviews for the moment. The PR team was drafting prepared language. A personal assistant from the airline offered him a ride home, or to the hotel of his choice. He refused both. He didn't want special treatment. He wanted reflection. From those who had watched and said nothing. From the crew who had stayed silent. And especially from the woman who had believed her uniform gave her the right to decide who belonged in first class. Jerome's phone buzzed again. This time a message from his assistant back at the courthouse. Public statement from Horizon Air expected in 2 hours. Internal affairs review underway. Media has picked it up. You've been requested for comment. He stared at the message for a long time, then typed back. Tell them this isn't about me. It's about what happens when people confuse their bias with authority. He hit send and placed the phone face down again. Outside, passengers moved like they always did, rushing to connections, grabbing coffee, pulling luggage behind them with tired arms. The world didn't stop for injustice. It never did. But today, it had noticed. And Rachel Benton. She was no longer just a name on a crew list. Inside the quiet administrative corridor of the airport, Rachel sat slouched forward in her chair, staring at her crew badge as if it were no longer hers. Her once pristine uniform now looked like a costume, something worn to play a role she no longer believed she deserved. The internal affairs team had stepped out for a moment to gather additional documentation, but the silence in the room was louder than any interrogation. Her thoughts raced, disjointed and looping. Why did I do that? Why didn't I check again? Why him? Why only him? She had thought this job was her identity. Her reputation was flawless, or so she believed. She'd been promoted faster than others, often praised for her efficiency and control. But none of that mattered now, because the one thing she was never supposed to lose, her judgment, was what had failed her. Across the airport, Jerome sat in the executive lounge, though he hadn't touched the refreshments offered to him. His briefcase rested by his feet, and his phone screen remained dark on the table. He was alone by choice. His assistant had offered to stay, but he had asked for privacy, for stillness, for space to breathe. He wasn't angry. Anger was reactive, temporary, and it rarely solved anything. What he felt now was a quieter weight, something heavier than fury. He had experienced moments of bias before, plenty of them. But this one had cut deeper, not because he was removed from a seat, not because of the stares or whispers, but because Rachel had looked at him and made a decision, not based on evidence, not based on rules, but based on what she thought she saw. He hadn't been treated like a man with a first-class ticket. He'd been treated like someone who didn't belong, And that, more than anything, was what made this moment matter. His phone vibrated gently on the table. He glanced down. Incoming call. Chief Justice Whitaker. He answered. "Jerome," came the voice on the line, steady and direct. "I've been briefed. It's already making the rounds. I figured it would. I've received calls from 3 networks already, asking for a statement. I've told them we won't speak until we see Horizon's official response." Jerome exhaled through his nose. "Fair enough." There was a pause, then the Chief Justice added, "You handled this with restraint. Most people would have made a scene." Jerome smiled slightly. "And what would that have changed?" "It would have given them something to dismiss you for," came the reply. "Instead, you gave them silence, and they filled it with fear." Jerome nodded, though the chief couldn't see him. "Let me know if anything changes." "We will, and Jerome?" "Yes? This may start with one airline, but it's bigger than that. This is about dignity, the kind people forget until someone makes them remember." The call ended. Jerome sat for a moment longer, then slowly stood, gathering his briefcase. He didn't wait for anyone to tell him what came next. He had been in enough rooms to know when a story had reached its turning point. Back in the internal review room, Rachel's eyes jumped as the door opened, and Glenn Pierce stepped back in. He held a printed folder in one hand and a sealed envelope in the other. "Ms. Benton," he said, taking his seat across from her. "After review of your conduct, and under direct order from senior management, your position as lead flight attendant is being placed under suspension, effective immediately." Rachel's hands tightened into fists, her nails digging into her palms. "You will be required to attend a formal disciplinary hearing within 5 business days," Glenn continued. "Until then, you are not to engage in any work duties, enter airline premises, or contact passengers from Flight 714. She said nothing. She didn't argue. She didn't even look surprised. Glenn slid the sealed envelope across the table. "These are your terms of suspension. You may read them later." "Do I still get to speak to him?" she asked, her voice low. Glenn hesitated. "That's not our call to make. He hasn't requested any contact." Rachel nodded once, blinking hard to fight the sting in her eyes. "He didn't scream," she whispered. Glenn leaned forward slightly. He didn't. He didn't even argue with me." "No, he didn't," Glenn said again. "And that's what's going to stay with everyone. Because silence from someone like him speaks louder than anything else." Rachel felt something inside her crack, a kind of sorrow she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Not guilt over the punishment, but over the realization that he had carried the humiliation for her mistake so gracefully, and that she had offered him nothing but her assumptions in return. Later that afternoon, Horizon Air released an official statement. "We acknowledge an incident involving a passenger of high standing who was subjected to improper treatment by a senior crew member aboard Flight 714. We are conducting a full investigation. The airline does not tolerate discriminatory conduct under any circumstance." But public response had already begun writing its own version. Across social media platforms, videos and posts emerged from passengers who had seen the incident unfold. He said nothing, just picked up his bag and walked to the back. The whole cabin felt it. We all watched. None of us said a word. That's the part I can't stop thinking about. She looked right at him and just decided. I've seen that before, too many times. And while the airline tried to manage the storm, one name continued to circulate quietly but powerfully. Jerome Collins. Not because he had made noise, but because he hadn't needed to. His silence had done what outrage couldn't. It had exposed something too real to ignore. 3 days had passed since Flight 714 landed, and yet the echoes of what occurred mid-air had not faded. They had multiplied. The video hadn't even come from Jerome. It came from a college student seated in business class, who had quietly recorded the interaction between Rachel and Jerome as it happened. She hadn't meant to capture a viral moment. She had simply sensed something wasn't right. The video was only 48 seconds long. It showed the moment Rachel demanded the seat be vacated, the moment Jerome quietly stood, and the moment he walked down the aisle toward the back of the plane without saying a single word. No shouting, no confrontation, just silence. But that silence, recorded through the grainy lens of a phone camera, reached over 4 million views in less than 2 days. News outlets picked it up. The headlines varied in wording, but not in tone. Federal judge removed from first class despite valid ticket. Discrimination in the skies, airline under fire. Flight 714, silence that sparked a firestorm. Talk shows debated it. Commentators dissected it. Aviation professionals weighed in on protocol violations, and legal analysts pointed out the deeper systemic implications. But for Jerome Collins, the whirlwind outside meant little. He had not appeared in interviews. He had issued no public statements. He had attended 2 closed-door meetings, one with Horizon's legal team and one with their board of ethics. He spoke clearly, briefly, without anger, without vengeance, just facts. When asked if he intended to sue, he simply said, "That depends on what you do when the cameras are gone." Meanwhile, Rachel Benton had gone home, suspended, silent, forgotten by those who once praised her professionalism. She lived alone in a small apartment 2 blocks from the airport, decorated with framed certificates, years of recognition, letters from co-workers thanking her for mentorship. But now those frames stared back at her like reminders of a person she wasn't sure she still was. She hadn't left the apartment since returning from the hearing. The airline had offered a counselor. She declined. They sent a packet of PR guidelines in case she chose to speak. She never opened it. What haunted her most wasn't the punishment. It was that she finally saw the moment from the outside, the way she had walked up to him, the tone she used, the way her posture shifted from professionalism to suspicion in a split second, without cause. She remembered the slight tightening of her mouth when he handed her his ticket, the voice she used, louder than it needed to be, public. And worse, she remembered feeling confident while doing it. She hadn't just made a bad call. She had revealed who she had allowed herself to become. And now, she couldn't hide from it. On the 4th evening, a plain envelope arrived at her door with no return address. Inside was a single printed email addressed to her, forwarded through the airline. It was from Jerome Collins. Subject: accountability. Ms. Benton, I don't write this to grant forgiveness. That's not what this is for. I write this because silence can either be a shield or a mirror. You saw my silence and thought it meant compliance. What it actually meant was restraint. I don't want a performance from you. I don't need a headline apology. But I do hope, for your own sake, not for mine, that you take this moment to ask yourself what you really saw when you looked at me, and why that was enough for you to act the way you did. That answer doesn't belong in a report. It belongs between you and your conscience. J. Collins. Rachel read the message 3 times, each slower than the last. She folded it and placed it on her kitchen counter. She didn't cry. She didn't rip it up. She didn't text anyone about it. She just sat down. And for the first time since that flight, she stopped trying to explain herself, even to herself. Elsewhere, at a quiet courthouse 2 states away, Jerome returned to his chambers. The clerks greeted him with quiet nods. The court officers stood a little straighter as he passed. The respect had always been there, but now it felt different. In his office, a stack of letters awaited him, some from law schools, some from public interest groups, some from strangers, some handwritten, most with the same message: "Thank you for how you handled it." Jerome didn't respond to most, but he read every one. He knew this wasn't about becoming a symbol. He hadn't set out to teach anyone a lesson. He had just wanted to take his seat, quietly, like any other passenger. But when that choice was stolen, he chose not to fight for it with noise, but with calm certainty that the truth would do the talking for him. And it did. Not because he shouted, but because he didn't need to. And in a world used to loud injustice, it was the silence that echoed the longest. A week later, the airline industry moved on. New flights took off. Delayed departures annoyed travelers. Weather advisories lit up screens in departure lounges. To the average traveler, Flight 714 was a headline that had come and gone, just another social media flare-up in an endless feed of viral outrage. But inside Horizon Air's executive headquarters, the story was far from over. In a tall glass building overlooking the city skyline, the boardroom was full. Senior executives, legal counsel, public relations officers, HR directors, and operational heads sat around a polished oak table. At the far end sat Alan Drexler, CEO of Horizon Air, hands clasped, expression grave. In front of him sat a thick binder labeled Flight 714, Full Incident Review. The air in the room was tense. He tapped the table twice. Let's begin. The head of HR, a woman named Naomi Klein, opened with the internal report. Rachel Benton has received official suspension. Her conduct violated both crew protocol and anti-discrimination policies. Her decision to remove Judge Collins was made without authorization, proper verification, or justifiable concern. She has since admitted to relying on her instincts, which she now understands were shaped by bias. Is she terminated? Drexler asked flatly. She's submitted a letter of resignation this morning, Naomi replied. Effective immediately. Drexler gave a slow nod. And the public response. The head of PR, Monica Fielding, chimed in. We've released 2 statements, one formal apology and one follow-up with a list of corrective actions. We've received over 12,000 emails from customers, some demanding boycotts, others praising our accountability. The hashtag number Judge 714 is still trending, mostly in positive association with how Judge Collins handled the incident. She paused, flipping through her notes. We've also seen a 9% drop in ticket purchases for routes in the Northeast region. Our competitors are using it against us in ad campaigns. Drexler's jaw tightened. And the judge? He asked. Refused interviews, Monica replied. He gave one written statement to the New York Ledger yesterday. She read aloud, I did not ask to be the center of this story. My intention was never to punish, but to expose a quiet failure we all share. The failure to question our assumptions before acting on them. I hope this isn't just a lesson for one airline, but a standard for every gate, every cabin, and every uniformed employee who carries the power to include or exclude. The room was silent for several seconds. Drexler finally stood. I want every crew member in this company retrained, every single one, top to bottom, not just on protocol, on perception. I don't want a single employee making a decision based on how someone looks ever again. Heads nodded. Some scribbled notes. No one objected. He looked around the room. We got lucky. That man chose dignity over destruction. We won't get that lucky again. Meeting adjourned. That same afternoon, across the city, in a modest high school auditorium, Jerome Collins took the stage, not as a judge, not as a headline figure, but as a speaker for a youth leadership event. The audience was a mix of high school students, local teachers, and parents. He wasn't there to talk about airline policies. He was there to talk about restraint. I was taught, he began, his voice low but firm, that power is not shown in how loud you speak, but in what you choose not to say. He paused, letting the words settle in the quiet room. Sometimes, silence is a shield. Sometimes it's a mirror. And sometimes, it's the only tool left to show someone the weight of what they've done. He looked out over the audience. Young faces, eyes wide, some confused, some understanding. I've sat on a bench in a courtroom for nearly 2 decades. I've listened to hundreds of voices trying to defend a moment they can't take back. And do you know what's almost always missing in their explanations? A pause, then accountability. That word echoed differently than any gavel he had ever dropped. Meanwhile, in a small apartment not far from the city, Rachel Benton read those words in a newspaper left outside her door. She hadn't opened it by habit. She didn't expect her name to be there. She read every line of Jerome's speech without blinking. Then she folded the page and placed it beside the envelope that still sat untouched on her kitchen counter, the one with her official resignation confirmation. No one had contacted her, no media, No friends from work. No supervisors. She was alone now. And that, perhaps, was the point. Because for the first time in years, she was forced to sit with the version of herself that had been unchallenged, unquestioned, until one man quietly made the world look her way. And still, he never raised his voice. She looked at his words again and whispered them aloud. Power is not shown in how loud you speak, but in what you choose not to say. He paused, letting the words settle in the quiet room. Sometimes silence is a shield, sometimes it's a mirror, and sometimes it's the only tool left to show someone the weight of what they've done. He looked out over the audience. Young faces, eyes wide, some confused, some understanding. I've sat on a bench in a courtroom for nearly 2 decades. I've listened to hundreds of voices trying to defend a moment they can't take back. And do you know what's almost always missing in their explanations? A pause. Then, accountability. That word echoed differently than any gavel he had ever dropped. Meanwhile, in a small apartment not far from the city, Rachel Benton read those words in a newspaper left outside her door. She hadn't opened it by habit. She didn't expect her name to be there. She read every line of Jerome's speech without blinking. Then she folded the page and placed it beside the envelope that still sat untouched on her kitchen counter, the one with her official resignation confirmation. No one had contacted her, no media, no friends from work, no supervisors. She was alone now. And that, perhaps, was the point. Because for the first time in years she was forced to sit with the version of herself that had been unchallenged, unquestioned, until one man quietly made the world look her way. And still, he never raised his voice. She looked at his words again and whispered them aloud. Power is not shown in how loud you speak, but in what you choose not to say. Then, for the first time in days, she stood up, walked to her desk, and opened her laptop. Not to defend herself, not to explain, but to begin writing the apology no one had demanded, but one she finally understood she needed to give. Not for headlines, not for her job, for the man who never raised his voice, because he didn't need to. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the incident on Flight 714, and while the public's attention had gradually shifted to other stories, in certain corners of the world, legal offices, airline union meetings, civil rights forums, the story was far from over. It had sparked more than outrage. It had sparked conversation, review, and most of all, reflection. At a small community college on the east side of the city, Jerome Collins was invited as a guest speaker by a professor of sociology. The topic wasn't air travel or discrimination laws, it was perception versus truth. The room was filled with students who had seen his story unfold in headlines and hashtags, but had never heard directly from him. He didn't carry notes, he never did. I want to talk about power, he began, resting his hands on the podium. Not the kind that comes from position, but the kind that comes from how we choose to respond when someone tries to take our dignity. The room was completely still. He looked around, locking eyes with a few of the students. I was told to move from a seat I paid for. No explanation, no real reason. Just a decision someone made about me based on what they thought they saw. He paused. I could have fought, yelled, demanded. But I've learned that shouting in rooms that weren't built to hear you doesn't always open doors. Sometimes it just gives them more excuses to close them. He stepped away from the podium slightly. So instead, I waited. I made one call. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted accountability. He paused again. And now the world is asking itself a question it should have asked long ago. How many other people didn't have that phone number, that influence, that platform? How many people were pushed out of their rightful seats, and no one ever saw it? The room stirred. A girl in the front row nodded, visibly moved. A young man in the back wiped his eyes and looked down at his notebook. Jerome continued, his voice even but charged. What happened to me isn't the worst thing I've experienced, not by far. But the reason it matters is because it happened in public. It happened while people were watching, and they said nothing. Not because they're bad people, but because they've been taught to stay quiet, to not cause trouble, to look the other way. He leaned forward slightly. You have to unlearn that. A quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Elsewhere, far from the spotlight, in a therapy office across town, Rachel Benton sat on a couch, her eyes red-rimmed and her fingers twisting a tissue in her lap. The therapist, gentle, observant, had said little so far. Rachel had come voluntarily, unsure what she wanted to say. I used to think I was fair, Rachel said, her voice low. I thought I treated everyone equally. But that's not what fairness is. Fairness isn't just what you think you believe. It's what you do when you're not being watched. She looked down, her voice trembling. I looked at him, and I made a decision in seconds. Not because he did anything wrong, but because something in me was wired to doubt someone like him in a place like that. She swallowed hard. And then, I doubled down. I made him walk to the back of the plane, in front of everyone, and I felt justified while doing it. The therapist gave her time. Rachel continued. I didn't realize what I'd done until he looked at me. He didn't say anything. He didn't even look angry. Just disappointed. Like I was smaller than he thought I'd be. Her shoulders sagged. He didn't embarrass me. He didn't fight back, and that made it worse. Because he gave me every chance to stop. And I didn't. There was a long pause before she whispered, and now I can't undo it. The therapist finally spoke. You can't undo the past, but you can change how you carry it forward. Rachel looked up, tears welling. What if I don't deserve to move forward? The therapist said simply, then earn it. Later that evening, Rachel opened her laptop again. This time, not to draft an apology for corporate approval, not for PR damage control, but something honest, something real. She began typing. To Judge Collins, you don't owe me a response. You don't owe me anything at all, but I owe you the truth. I saw you take your seat and made a judgment I can never justify. It wasn't about rules. It wasn't about procedure. It was about my bias. I took one look and decided you didn't belong. I humiliated you. I did it with confidence, and I did it in front of others. And still, you didn't raise your voice. You didn't insult me. You didn't try to make me feel small. You simply made one call and let the truth do the rest. That silence exposed me more than shouting ever could. You asked me to ask myself why I did what I did. I've been asking. I'm still asking. I don't have a full answer yet, but I know this. I was wrong. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure I don't just regret it, but change because of it. Rachel Benton. She hovered over the send button, heart pounding, unsure if she deserved the chance to be heard. But finally, with trembling hands, she clicked it. And in that small, quiet moment, without a uniform, without authority, without power, she did something she hadn't done in years. She told the truth. And somewhere in the city, far from cameras and headlines, Jerome Collins received the message. He read every word. Then he closed his laptop, and for the first time in 2 weeks, he exhaled. The morning sun filtered softly through the tall windows of Jerome Collins's study. The air was still, filled only with the quiet hum of a ceiling fan and the distant chirping of birds outside. He sat in his armchair, a fresh cup of coffee resting beside him, and his laptop open in his lap. The email from Rachel Benton still sat on the screen, unanswered, untouched since last night. He'd read it 3 times already. It wasn't just the words that lingered, it was the weight behind them, the clarity, the rawness, the absence of excuses. For a woman who had once spoken over him, dismissed him, and walked away with pride, this email didn't read like a performance. It read like a confession. He didn't know if she meant every word. People often said the right things after the consequences hit. But this didn't feel like she was trying to reclaim her career or image. It felt like she was trying to rebuild her self-worth from the ground up. Jerome leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. He wasn't a man who carried grudges. His entire life had taught him how heavy they were. He had learned that the world would offer no shortage of moments to feel wronged, to feel betrayed, to feel reduced by someone's shallow view of you. But he also learned that the truest test of a man wasn't what he did when others respected him. It was what he chose when they didn't. That choice had followed him onto Flight 714. That choice had made the world stop and watch. And now, that same choice had turned an apology into something bigger than he expected. Across the city, Rachel sat on a park bench, her first time outside in over a week. She wore no makeup, no uniform, no mask of control or confidence. Just jeans, a coat, and a face that looked a little older than it had 2 weeks ago. The world hadn't fallen apart, but hers had. And maybe it needed to. She watched people pass, fathers with strollers, students on bikes, elderly couples arm in arm. She wondered how many times she'd passed someone like Jerome before, at the grocery store, in hotel lobbies, boarding gates, and thought nothing of it. Or worse, thought something she never questioned. A child on the swing nearby laughed, and for a moment Rachel smiled, not because she felt better, but because life hadn't stopped. The world had gone on, and she had a chance, however small, to meet it with new eyes. Back in Jerome's study, he finally clicked reply. He didn't write much, he didn't need to. Ms. Benton, I accept your apology. Not because I need it, but because you do. I hope you never forget this, and I hope you never stop doing the hard work of becoming better. That is the only apology that truly matters. JC. He hit send. And just like that, the final chapter of the story began. Not the kind written in headlines, not broadcasted across comment sections or media panels, but the quiet kind. The kind that lives in changed hearts, in humbled egos, in new conversations that start because one man refused to raise his voice. And one woman finally decided to listen. Days turned into weeks. The public forgot the story. New scandals replaced old ones. New faces filled the news cycle. But the effects lingered. Horizon Air began a nationwide training overhaul, not just in customer service, but in racial bias awareness, perception training, and power conduct. They opened a reporting channel for passengers to document any discriminatory treatment, directly accessible by their ethics committee. Other airlines followed, not because they were pressured, but because someone had set the standard. Airports invited legal consultants to revise how passengers were treated in first class, security checkpoints, and gate management. Schools began using Jerome's story in social science classes. Universities invited him to speak, not as a judge, but as a case study in dignity, silence, and systemic bias. And Rachel? She didn't go back to flying. She didn't try to sue or defend herself online. She took a job at a local community center, helping young people prepare for job interviews, travel, and public interaction. She spoke openly about her mistake, about the blind spots she once carried with pride, not as a hero, but as someone who had fallen hard enough to learn the cost of certainty without compassion. In a small classroom one day, a teenage boy raised his hand and asked, "Why didn't he shout at you?" Rachel paused, her voice catching in her throat. Then she said softly, "Because he knew something I hadn't learned yet." "What's that?" the boy asked. "That silence doesn't mean weakness," she said. "Sometimes it means you've already won." The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that leaves you thinking long after you've left it. And somewhere far from that classroom, on a quiet walk back to his courthouse, Jerome Collins stepped into his chambers, greeted his clerk, adjusted his robe, and took his seat, exactly where he belonged. No one questioned it, no one challenged it, and no one dared to ask if he had earned it, because this time, the world had finally learned. Some people don't have to prove they belong. They always did. They were just waiting for everyone else and to catch up. If you liked this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories.